Karen always believed she deserved the best, especially when flying first class. But when she steps onto Flight 227 and sees someone she thinks doesn't belong in her exclusive space, she makes a mistake that will cost her everything. What starts as a petty complaint quickly spirals into chaos as Karen's arrogance clashes with the wrong woman, a flight crew that won't tolerate nonsense, and a husband who's finally had enough. With each misstep, she digs herself deeper into humiliation, pushing boundaries until there's no turning back. By the time the plane lands, Karen won't just lose her seat, she'll lose the one thing she never saw coming. Stay tuned, because this flight is about to get bumpy. Like, share, and subscribe for more stories like this. And let us know, where in the world are you watching from? Karen stepped onto the aircraft, chin lifted, eyes scanning the luxurious first-class cabin with approval. She had worked too hard to afford this kind of treatment: 5-star service, extra legroom, and most importantly, an exclusive environment. Her husband, Roger, followed behind, carrying her designer carry-on bag while she examined the passengers already seated. A young businessman in a crisp suit, a retired couple flipping through a travel magazine. Everything seemed appropriate until she saw her. A black woman sat calmly by the window, legs crossed, reading a hardcover book. She looked completely at ease, sipping from a complimentary glass of champagne, as if she belonged there. Karen's stomach twisted. No, something was off. She glanced at her ticket again. 3A, right next to the woman. She turned to Roger. I think there's been a mistake. Roger, already exhausted from dealing with her moods, sighed. What now, Karen? She gestured toward the woman in the window seat. That's supposed to be my seat, or at least someone else's. There's no way. Roger groaned. Karen, don't. But she was already moving forward, past the flight attendants, ignoring their polite greetings. Plastering on a tight smile, she leaned in close to the woman. Excuse me, Karen said sweetly. I think you may have taken the wrong seat. First class can be a little confusing sometimes. The woman looked up slowly, her dark eyes meeting Karen's with mild curiosity. I don't think so, she replied, setting down her book. This is my seat. Karen's smile didn't falter. Are you sure? Maybe you're meant to be in business class, or... The woman handed her boarding pass without another word. Karen snatched it up, scanning the ticket. Seat 3A. She blinked. That couldn't be right. Her irritation deepened as she shoved the ticket back. Are you traveling alone? She pressed, her voice taking on a sharper edge. The woman raised an eyebrow. Does it matter? Karen forced a laugh, but it came out hollow. It's just unexpected. I mean, I rarely see. She stopped herself just in time. The woman smirked. Rarely see what? Karen cleared her throat. Never mind. Roger, sensing disaster brewing, grabbed her arm. Karen, drop it. Let's just sit down. But Karen wasn't ready to let it go. Instead, she did what she did best. She made a scene. Spinning toward the flight attendant, she raised her voice just enough for surrounding passengers to hear. I need to speak with someone in charge. There has been a mix-up with seating arrangements. The flight attendant, a young woman with a professional but firm expression, approached. Ma'am, what seems to be the issue? Karen folded her arms. This woman is sitting in my seat. The flight attendant turned to the woman. Ma'am, may I check your ticket? With a knowing smile, the woman handed it over. The flight attendant glanced at it, then back at Karen. I'm sorry, ma'am, but she's in the correct seat. Karen's face darkened. That can't be right. Check again. Roger groaned into his hands. The flight attendant's voice remained calm but clipped. Ma'am, her ticket is valid for this seat. There is no mistake. Karen's mouth opened, then shut. For the first time in a long time, she was at a loss for words. The woman picked up her book again, her smirk never fading. Karen's hands clenched into fists. This wasn't over. She would find a way to fix this, even if she had to make everyone on this plane uncomfortable in the process. She wasn't going to lose. Karen felt the heat of humiliation creeping up her neck as a few nearby passengers glanced over, curiosity flickering in their eyes. She wasn't about to let this go. Not now. Not when she knew something wasn't right about this situation. She turned to Roger, expecting him to back her up. But he was already rubbing his temples, staring at the ceiling as if pleading with some higher power to intervene. Typical. Spineless as always. Karen straightened her blouse and faced the flight attendant with an air of authority. I want to speak to your supervisor. The flight attendant's professional smile didn't waver. Ma'am, I am the head attendant for this cabin. Karen huffed. Then I want to speak to the pilot. At that, a murmur rippled through the first-class cabin. A businessman a few rows ahead snorted, shaking his head. A woman 2 seats down whispered something to her husband, both of them chuckling softly. Karen's face burned hotter. They were laughing at her. The flight attendant's patience thinned. Ma'am, unless this is a safety concern, the captain is preparing for departure and cannot be disturbed. Karen's nails dug into her palm. This is a safety concern. I paid thousands of dollars for this seat, and I expect to sit next to people who she stopped short. Too late. The damage was done. Ava, the woman she had been trying to push out of her seat, slowly turned her head. One eyebrow arched. People who what exactly? Karen forced out a tight smile. People who belong here. Roger groaned, under his breath. Oh, God! Ava let out a small chuckle, shaking her head. Fascinating. Karen bristled. Excuse me? Ava shut her book with deliberate slowness. You're assuming I don't belong here. And why is that exactly? Karen's mouth opened, but nothing came out. Ava leaned in slightly, her voice softer now. Because I don't look like someone who flies first class? Karen stiffened. I never said that. Ava tilted her head. You didn't have to. The conversation had drawn an audience. Passengers were no longer pretending not to listen. Some looked irritated. Others looked outright amused. Karen's pulse pounded. This woman was making her out to be the villain. She needed to turn this around. Karen let out a forced laugh. Oh, come on. You're overreacting. I just found it surprising, that's all. Ava smirked. Surprising? That a black woman can afford first class. Karen sputtered. I never said that. Ava leaned back, studying her with an unreadable expression. Maybe you didn't, but you thought it. Karen's patience snapped. I don't have time for this nonsense. She turned back to the flight attendant. Move her. A few gasps. Someone actually laughed. The flight attendant's face hardened. Ma'am, if you continue to behave in this manner, I'll have no choice but to notify the captain. Karen scoffed. For what? Expecting decent service. A man from across the aisle spoke up, an older gentleman with sharp blue eyes. No. For being a nuisance. More murmurs. Another chuckle. Karen's skin prickled. This wasn't how this was supposed to go. Roger tugged at her sleeve. Karen, enough. Let it go. She yanked her arm away. Let it go. Let it go. The very thought was insulting. She had never let anything go in her life. She turned back to Ava, who was watching her with that maddeningly calm expression. Karen hated that look, that confidence, that smugness. Like Ava knew something she didn't. And Karen was going to fix that. She forced another smile. You know what? Fine. If you refuse to move, then I'll just get my lawyer involved once we land. Ava raised an eyebrow. Your lawyer? Karen folded her arms. That's right. I have connections. I know people. Ava let out a small, amused sigh. Funny. I know people too. With that, she reached into her bag, pulled out her phone, and made a call. Karen's stomach twisted. Who was she calling? And why did she suddenly have a feeling that she had just made a very big mistake? Karen's throat tightened as Ava lifted the phone to her ear. The woman didn't look angry. No, she looked amused. and that made Karen even more furious. Who the hell did this woman think she was? Karen folded her arms tightly, shooting a glance at Roger, hoping for support. But he was already sinking lower into his seat, rubbing his temples as if regretting his life choices. Coward. Ava tapped her manicured nails against the armrest, waiting for the call to connect. Then, in a calm, almost bored voice, she spoke. Hey, babe. I just wanted to let you know I'm on the plane, but there's been an incident. Karen's stomach did a small flip. Babe. Ava tilted her head slightly, her eyes locking onto Karen's as she continued. Yeah, there's a woman here who seems to think I don't belong in first class. She's been causing a scene, demanding I move, and now she's threatening legal action. Karen's mouth went dry. She wasn't threatening legal action. She was just making a point. The murmurs around the cabin grew louder. More passengers were watching now, some outright staring. The businessman across the aisle pulled out his phone, possibly recording. Karen felt her face grow hot. Then, Ava spoke again, 2 words that sent a jolt of panic straight through Karen's chest. Oh, you're coming? Karen's fingers curled around the strap of her handbag. Who exactly was Ava talking to? Roger finally looked up, his brow furrowed. Karen, maybe we should just know. Karen snapped, her voice sharper than intended. She cleared her throat, lowering her tone. I am not going to be bullied by this woman. Ava let out a soft chuckle, shaking her head as she ended the call. Don't worry, she said smoothly, tucking her phone away. This will all be handled soon. Karen stiffened. Handled? What's that supposed to mean? Ava just smiled. You'll see. Karen's nails dug into her palm. She hated this. She hated not being in control. Then, as if on cue, a new presence entered the cabin. A tall man, broad-shouldered, dressed in a pristine pilot's uniform. His golden stripes gleamed under the cabin lights as he strode down the aisle with an air of authority. Karen's stomach plummeted. The murmurs among passengers turned into excited whispers. A few even pulled out their phones, sensing that something was about to go down. Karen forced herself to sit up straighter. She needed to take control before things got worse. She turned to the man, lifting her chin. Oh, thank goodness. You must be the captain. I was just actually, Ava interrupted, a smirk playing on her lips. This is my brother. Silence. Karen blinked. You're what? The pilot, Captain Marcus Bryant, crossed his arms, his eyes sharp as they locked onto Karen. I was informed that we had a disruptive passenger on board. Karen's heart pounded. Disruptive? I was just asking a simple question about seating arrangements. Ava sighed, leaning back. No, Karen. You were demanding I be moved. You were loud. You insulted the flight staff. And let's not forget your little lawyer threat. Karen scoffed. This is absurd. Captain Bryant held up a hand, cutting her off. Ma'am, I take incidents like this very seriously. If you're unable to behave in a respectful manner, I have the authority to remove you from this flight. Karen's stomach clenched. No. No, no, no. This wasn't happening. She turned to Roger, but her husband was now avoiding her gaze entirely. She forced out a laugh, desperate to regain control. Okay, let's not be dramatic here. I was just surprised, that's all. I wasn't trying to. Captain Bryant wasn't listening. He turned to the flight attendant. Has she interfered with crew operations? The flight attendant nodded. She's repeatedly caused a disturbance, sir. Karen clenched her jaw. I paid for this seat. You can't just throw me off. Captain Bryant exhaled sharply, his patience thinning. You're right. You did pay for a first-class seat. But what you didn't pay for is the right to harass another passenger or mistreat my crew. Karen's breathing quickened. This was spiraling out of control. Passengers were smiling now, enjoying her humiliation. No, she would not be humiliated like this. But then, just when she thought things couldn't get any worse, Ava reached for her glass of water. And Karen had just enough time to register what was about to happen before splash. Ice-cold water soaked through Karen's expensive blouse. Gasps. Then laughter. Karen let out a shriek, jumping up from her seat. "You," Ava set her empty glass down, crossing her legs casually. "Oh, I'm so sorry. My hand must have slipped." The cabin erupted into cheers. Karen's entire body shook with rage. And then Captain Bryant spoke. Again. "Ma'am," he said firmly, "I'll give you one last chance. Either calm down, or we will be making arrangements for your removal." Karen's mouth opened, then closed. For the first time in her life, she had nothing to say. Karen sat frozen, her blouse clinging to her skin, the ice-cold water dripping down her arms. The laughter of the passengers rang in her ears, each chuckle like a dagger slicing through her pride. How dare this woman embarrass her like this? Karen's fingers twitched, her nails digging into her palms as she willed herself to stay composed. She could still fix this. She just needed to regain control. Taking a deep breath, she forced a tight smile and turned to Captain Bryant. "Captain," she said, voice trembling with barely restrained anger, this is assault. You saw what she did. I demand that she be removed from the flight immediately." Ava tilted her head, unimpressed. "Assault? Oh, honey, if I really wanted to throw something, trust me, you'd know." The passengers burst into laughter again. Karen's fists clenched. Why was no one on her side? Captain Bryant sighed, clearly running out of patience. "Ma'am, you caused this situation. You instigated it. You disrupted the flight. And now you're trying to play the victim?" Karen's face burned. Victim? Victim? She was the victim. She was the one being mistreated, laughed at, disrespected. She needed anyone to back her up. Desperate, she turned to Roger. "Roger, say something." Her husband, who had been silent for most of the ordeal, finally lifted his head. He looked at her for a long moment. Then, in a voice so quiet yet so damning, he said, "Karen, stop." Silence. Karen's breath caught in her throat. "What?" Roger exhaled, rubbing a hand down his face. "I'm done, Karen. I'm done with this nonsense. You're embarrassing yourself. You're embarrassing me." Karen's stomach dropped. No. No, no, no. He was her husband. He was supposed to defend her, not take their side. She shook her head, her voice rising in panic. "You're taking her side?" Roger let out a bitter chuckle. "I'm taking the side of common sense, Karen. You're making a fool of yourself." A fresh wave of murmurs spread through the cabin. Karen felt her vision blur. She had never been this humiliated in her entire life. Her own husband had turned against her. Ava, still relaxed in her seat, raised an eyebrow. "Well, that's gotta hurt." Laughter rippled through the passengers again. Karen could barely breathe. Her heart pounded in her chest. She needed to regain control now. She spun back to the flight. "Attendant, I demand to speak with corporate. I will not be treated this way. I will have every single one of you fired." Captain Bryant exhaled through his nose, then nodded toward the flight attendant. "Move her." Karen's eyes widened. What?" The flight attendant, now accompanied by a second crew member, gestured toward the aisle. "Ma'am, we're downgrading your seat. You're being moved to economy class." Karen shot up from her seat. "You can't do that. I paid for first class." Captain Bryant's voice was final. "You also agreed to follow the airline's conduct policy. And right now, you're a disruption. You can either take your new seat in economy, or we will remove you from the flight entirely." Karen's pulse pounded. No. No, no, and no. This wasn't happening. This couldn't be happening. She looked around, searching for sympathy, for anyone who might step in. Nothing. Passengers looked at her with irritation, amusement, or worse, complete indifference. Even Roger wouldn't meet her eyes. For the first time in her life, she had lost. Completely. Karen let out a sharp breath, forcing down the bile rising in her throat. She had to save face. Fine, she snapped, snatching up her designer bag. I wouldn't want to sit next to this kind of company anyway. Ava grinned. Bon voyage, Karen. Karen's face twisted, but she bit her tongue. With stiff, jerky movements, she stormed down the aisle toward the economy section. The sound of applause followed her all the way there. Karen stormed down the narrow aisle, her designer heels clicking against the carpeted floor with each furious step. She clutched her handbag so tightly that her knuckles turned white. She could still hear them. The applause, the whispers, the laughter. Her entire body burned with humiliation. This wasn't just a downgrade, this was a public execution. She had walked onto this plane expecting first-class treatment, and now she was being paraded through the economy section like some disgraced queen stripped of her crown. She wouldn't stand for it. She couldn't stand for it. Her seat in economy was near the middle of the section, wedged between a coughing old man and a mother struggling to keep her toddler from kicking the seat in front of him. Karen froze, staring at the cramped, worn-out seat as if it were a prison cell. No extra legroom, no champagne, no luxury. She turned to the flight attendant who had escorted her. This must be a mistake. The flight attendant gave her a tight smile. This is the only available seat, ma'am. Karen's breath hitched. This is unacceptable. I paid for first class. The flight attendant's patience was clearly wearing thin. And you lost first class due to your behavior. Karen's jaw clenched. She wanted to scream, but she knew she had already made a big enough scene. With an audible huff, she threw herself into the seat, crossing her arms like a pouting child. The old man beside her let out a chest-rattling cough, barely covering his mouth. Karen flinched, recoiling in disgust. Then bam! The toddler behind her slammed his tiny sneakers into the back of her seat. Karen's teeth ground together. This is a nightmare. She turned around sharply. Excuse me, can you control your child? The mother looked up, exhaustion written all over her face. I'm doing my best, ma'am. Well, your best isn't good enough, Karen snapped. The mother frowned, opening her mouth to respond, but the flight attendant reappeared. Is there a problem here, ma'am? Karen forced a tight-lipped smile. No problem. She couldn't afford to be thrown off the flight entirely. Not after everything. She had already lost too much. Meanwhile, back in first class, Ava sipped her champagne, stretching her legs in the luxurious space Karen had once occupied. Passengers around her were still chuckling, some whispering about Karen's meltdown. Roger, however, remained silent. Ava glanced at him. Not going with her? Roger exhaled heavily. I think she needs to cool off. And I need a break from her. Ava studied him for a moment. You don't seem surprised by how she acted. Roger gave a dry laugh. Oh, trust me, I'm not. Ava smirked, swirling the champagne in her glass. So why put up with it? Roger hesitated. His shoulders slumped slightly. I used to think she just had high standards. But now, I'm starting to realize she just doesn't know how to be happy unless she's looking down on someone. Ava raised her glass. Here's to finally seeing the truth. Roger let out another bitter chuckle, shaking his head. Yeah, here's to that. He glanced toward the economy section, where Karen was barely visible among the rows of passengers. For the first time in a long time, Roger felt lighter. Karen sat stiffly in her cramped economy seat, her arms crossed so tightly that her nails dug into her skin. The old man beside her coughed again, and she pressed herself against the armrest, barely restraining a gag. The toddler behind her kicked the seat with relentless energy, each thud sending a fresh jolt of rage through her spine. She had never felt more degraded in her life. The worst part? No one cared. No one rushed to defend her, to acknowledge the injustice of what had just happened. Not Roger. Not the flight attendants. Not even the other passengers. Karen's lips thinned. She needed a way to fix this, to take back control. She reached into her handbag and pulled out her phone, her hands shaking with fury as she tapped the airline's customer service number. The automated voice came on almost immediately. "Thank you for calling our customer care line. Please hold for the next available representative." Karen gritted her teeth as bland, hold music filled her ears. Unacceptable. Absolutely unacceptable. Her anger simmered as she stole a glance toward the first-class section, just barely able to see over the curtains separating it from economy. There was Roger, still in first class, laughing. With her, Karen's stomach twisted. Ava was leaning slightly toward him, a smug smirk on her lips, her glass of champagne glinting under the cabin lights. And Roger, her husband, looked at ease, relaxed, like he wasn't even thinking about her. Karen's grip on her phone tightened. She had to make him regret this. All of them. Just as she was about to try calling again, she felt a tap on her shoulder. She turned, already annoyed. What? A teenage girl with braces and an oversized hoodie grinned at her. "Aren't you the crazy lady from first class?" Karen's eye twitched. "Excuse me?" The girl giggled, pulling out her phone. "Yeah, someone in first class was live streaming it. You're like all over social media right now." Karen's breath hitched. "You're lying." The girl turned her phone around, and there it was, a video of her mid-rant, red-faced, pointing aggressively at Ava while passengers laughed in the background. The caption? "Karen gets owned in first class, must watch." The view count was already in the thousands. Karen's vision blurred with rage. "Delete that." The girl snorted. Yeah, that's not how the internet works." "Lady." Karen nearly lunged for the phone, but the girl quickly recoiled, holding it out of reach. "Whoa. Chill out," she laughed. "You already look crazy enough." Karen's pulse pounded in her ears as passengers nearby chuckled, whispering among themselves. She felt trapped, like an animal in a cage, while the world pointed and laughed. And then, as if the universe wanted to drive the knife in deeper, another vicious kick to the back of her seat. Karen snapped. She whirled around, her voice shrill. "That is enough." The toddler immediately burst into tears. The mother gasped. "Are you seriously yelling at my child?" Karen's breathing was ragged. "Maybe if you parented properly, I wouldn't have to." Gasps erupted around her. The mother's face darkened. "Oh, hell no." Before Karen could react, the mother grabbed her half-full cup of orange juice splash. Cold liquid drenched Karen's already ruined blouse. The passengers erupted in laughter. Karen shrieked, wiping at herself frantically. "Are you insane?" The mother smirked. "Oops. My hand must have slipped." Karen's body shook with rage, her dignity now a distant memory. And then a familiar voice called out from the front of the cabin. "Is there a problem here?" Karen turned. Captain Bryant stood at the front of economy, arms crossed, looking entirely done with her. The humiliation wasn't over. Not yet. Karen sat frozen in her seat, her blouse damp with orange juice, her humiliation now complete. Every eye in economy was on her. Some passengers tried to stifle their laughter, while others didn't bother hiding their amusement at all. And now, standing at the front of the cabin, arms crossed, was Captain Bryant, Ava's brother. Karen's heart pounded in her chest. She forced herself to take a deep breath, wiping the sticky juice from her sleeves with trembling hands. She needed to regain control, to make someone see how unfairly she was being treated. She stood abruptly, pointing an accusatory finger at the mother who had thrown the juice at her. "Are you just going to let her assault me?" Captain Bryant didn't look impressed. "Ma'am, I was informed that you were harassing other passengers." "Again?" Karen scoffed, throwing up her hands. "Oh, please. I was just defending myself. First, I'm publicly humiliated in first class, then I get physically attacked in economy? Is this how your airline treats paying customers?" Captain Bryant raised an eyebrow. Paying customers who follow our rules don't seem to have this problem. Karen's lips pressed into a thin line. I want to file a formal complaint. Against her, she jabbed a finger at the mother. Against that Ava woman, against you, and against every single person who has disrespected me on this flight. The flight attendant who had been monitoring her from a few rows away sighed, stepping forward. Ma'am, this is your final warning. Karen blinked. Final warning? Captain Bryant's voice was firm. Either you sit down, stay quiet for the remainder of this flight, and stop disturbing passengers, or we land early and remove you. Karen's stomach dropped. You can't do that. Captain Bryant tilted his head. Ma'am, I can land this plane right now, and when we do, you'll be met by airport security. The murmurs of the passengers grew louder. Karen swallowed hard. She knew he wasn't bluffing. A forced landing would mean serious consequences, fines, possibly even being banned from the airline. The very thought made her blood run cold. And Roger would never let her live this down. Karen turned, her gaze flicking toward first class. Through the small gap in the curtain, she could see him, still seated comfortably, still talking to her, her hands curled into fists. The man she had built a life with, the man who should have been on her side, was now sitting up there as if she didn't even exist. Karen's throat tightened. She had already lost too much. If she pushed any further, she would lose everything. For the first time in years, Karen did something she never did. She backed down. Slowly, stiffly, she lowered herself back into her seat. The flight attendant gave her a long, warning look before stepping away. Captain Bryant lingered for a moment longer, as if expecting her to start again. But Karen didn't. She clenched her jaw, fists trembling in her lap, eyes burning with unshed tears. Her dignity was gone. Her power was gone. And worst of all, the person she thought would always be in her corner was gone, too. Karen sat in stunned silence, her body rigid as the cabin finally settled. Conversations resumed, the whispers about her gradually fading into the general hum of the plane. But she still felt exposed, like she had been stripped of every ounce of respect and dignity she once commanded. Roger hadn't come after her. She had hoped that maybe, just maybe, he would at least check on her. Maybe he would come crawling back, begging for her forgiveness after letting her be humiliated in front of all these strangers. But the curtain separating first class from economy remained closed. He had chosen them over her. Her breathing was shallow, her mind spinning with memories of how Roger used to adore her, how he used to agree with her every opinion, how he never questioned her authority in any situation. When had things changed? Was it her? No. It wasn't her. It was them. Ava. The crew. The passengers. They had all conspired against her. Karen's jaw clenched as she stared blankly at the tray table in front of her. She wasn't the villain here. She was the victim. And she would prove it. Roger leaned back in his seat, staring at the half-empty glass of whiskey in his hand. The ice clinked softly as he swirled it, lost in thought. He had expected Karen to cause a scene. What he hadn't expected was how easily he had let go. For years, he had made excuses for her behavior. He had convinced himself that she was just particular, that she had high standards, that she expected more from the world. But today, he had seen her for what she really was. A woman who thrived on power. A woman who crumbled the second she lost control. And for the first time in their marriage, he felt free. Ava, sitting across the aisle, watched him for a moment before speaking. You okay over there? Roger let out a breathy chuckle. Define okay. Ava smirked, taking a sip of her champagne. Rough day, huh? Roger exhaled. You have no idea. Ava tilted her head slightly. So, what happens now? Roger looked down at his glass, his fingers tightening around it. That was the question, wasn't it? He could already picture the storm waiting for him after they landed. Karen wouldn't let this go. She never did. But for the first time, he wasn't sure if he cared. Maybe it was time to let go. Karen sat with her arms crossed, her lips pressed into a thin line. She was exhausted. Physically, mentally, but mostly, she was seething. She had stayed quiet just like they wanted. But that didn't mean she had accepted defeat. Oh no! She would remember every face, every name. And when they landed, she would make them pay. Ava, Captain Bryant, the airline itself. They thought this was over. They had no idea who they were dealing with. Karen's mind raced as she stared blankly at the back of the seat in front of her. The drone of the aircraft had become background noise, drowned out by the whirlwind of emotions crashing through her. She had lost today. She had been humiliated, belittled, and cast aside like she was nothing. But she wouldn't let this be the end of it. No. This was just the beginning. Her fingers tapped against the armrest, her nails clicking rhythmically as she planned her next move. The airline would be hearing from her. She would demand compensation for the way she had been treated. She would threaten legal action if necessary. And Roger, Karen's jaw clenched. Her husband, the man who was supposed to stand by her, had abandoned her. That betrayal burned deeper than anything else. How dare he? After everything she had done for him, after elevating his life, after making sure he always had the best, and this was how he repaid her? Sitting up there in first class, drinking whiskey like he didn't have a care in the world. Like she didn't exist. Karen's hands curled into fists. He thinks this is over? A sudden jolt shook the cabin. Karen's thoughts snapped back to reality as the seatbelt sign flickered on. The captain's voice came over the intercom. Ladies and gentlemen, we're experiencing some turbulence ahead. Please remain seated and fasten your seatbelts. The plane trembled again, a slight drop causing a few gasps from nervous passengers. Karen gripped the armrest, her nails digging into the plastic. This day just kept getting worse. The mother next to her struggled to keep her toddler calm, shushing him softly as he whimpered. The old man beside Karen tightened his seatbelt, muttering under his breath. Another jolt. Karen exhaled sharply, willing herself to stay calm. She had flown enough times to know turbulence was normal. But still, it felt fitting that the universe would throw this at her now, just to remind her how little control she had left. Her fingers tapped against the seatbelt buckle, her frustration mounting. She needed to do something. Anything. She couldn't just sit here, helpless. Then a thought. Her gaze flickered toward the curtain separating first class from economy. It was closed, but it wasn't locked. Karen's pulse quickened. She could go to Roger, confront him, remind him exactly who he was dealing with. Before she could second-guess herself, she unbuckled her seatbelt. A hand immediately landed on her arm. She turned, startled, to see the flight attendant from earlier, now kneeling slightly beside her seat. "Ma'am, I need you to remain seated," the attendant said firmly. Karen forced a polite smile. "I just need to use the restroom." The attendant didn't budge. "We're in turbulence. You'll have to wait." Karen clenched her teeth. Of course they were stopping her. Of course everyone was against her today. She exhaled sharply, forcing herself to nod. Fine. She buckled her seatbelt again, but her mind was already spinning. The second the turbulence passed, she would go. She would fix this. And Roger would wish he had never crossed her. The turbulence finally eased, and the plane steadied as the seatbelt sign blinked off. A collective breath of relief rippled through the passengers. Karen wasted no time. Without hesitation, she unbuckled her seatbelt and rose to her feet, ignoring the sideways glances from the people around her. She smoothed down her damp blouse, lifted her chin, and made her way toward the curtain separating economy from first class. This wasn't just about Roger anymore. This was about principle, about respect. And she was going to make sure everyone on this flight knew exactly who they were dealing with. As she reached for the curtain, a firm hand gripped her wrist. "Ma'am." Karen turned sharply, glaring at the flight attendant who had stopped her before. "What now?" she snapped. "You need to return to your seat." Karen huffed. "I am simply checking on my husband." The attendant didn't budge. "First class is restricted to first-class passengers. You are not a first-class passenger anymore." The words hit like a slap. Karen's face burned with rage. "This is ridiculous. I paid for first class. I belong there." The attendant's eyes remained calm. "Not anymore, ma'am." Murmurs started again. Passengers whispering, watching. Karen's breathing turned shallow. She had lost control. She had to regain it. So she did what she did best. She escalated. "If you don't let me through right now," Karen hissed, "I will have your job. Do you understand me?" The flight attendant didn't even blink. "Ma'am, please take your seat. This is your final warning." Karen let out a sharp, bitter laugh. "Oh, you think this is a warning? You have no idea who you're messing with." Then, without thinking, she shoved past the attendant and ripped open the curtain. Gasps erupted throughout the cabin. Karen stepped into first class, her eyes zeroing in on Roger. He was mid-conversation with Ava, his posture relaxed, his drink still in hand. Her chest tightened. He looked comfortable, like he wasn't even thinking about her. "Roger." He looked up. His expression barely changed. There was no surprise. No guilt. Only resignation. Karen's hands clenched at her sides. "You just let them do this to me?" Her voice wavered, raw with anger. "You just sat here while they humiliated me?" Roger sighed, setting his drink down. "Karen, go back to your seat." Her eyes widened. "What did you just say?" Roger met her gaze, his voice calm but firm. "Go back to your seat." Karen felt the floor drop beneath her. This wasn't the man she knew. This wasn't the man who always followed her, who always took her side. "You're choosing her over me?" she whispered, voice shaking. Ava chuckled softly. "Oh, honey, I think he's just choosing peace." Karen turned on her, eyes blazing. "You, ma'am." The deep, authoritative voice stopped her cold. Captain Bryant. He was standing a few feet away, arms crossed, watching everything. Karen swallowed hard. "You violated direct instructions from the crew," he said. "That's grounds for removal." Karen's heart raced. He wouldn't. He couldn't. I was just talking to my husband." Captain Bryant lifted a hand. "No more excuses." Then he turned to the flight attendant. "Call ahead to the airport. Have security waiting at the gate." Karen's blood ran cold. Security. She had pushed too far. Panic clawed at her throat. "Wait, no. But it was too late." Passengers were whispering, smiling, watching as she stood there, frozen, trapped. And Roger? He just shook his head. Not in anger. Not in sympathy. Just disappointment. Karen felt everything crumble. Her pride. Her power. Her marriage. The curtain was pulled shut behind her, and she was escorted back to her seat like a misbehaving child. And when the plane finally landed, she wasn't the first to leave. She wasn't even the last. She was escorted off the plane, past the passengers, past the flight crew, past Roger, and straight into the waiting arms of security. Her first-class life, over. Just like that. As Karen was escorted away, the passengers of Flight 227 watched in stunned silence. Some shook their heads, others smirked, and a few even recorded the moment, ensuring her downfall would live on far beyond this flight. Meanwhile, back in first class, Ava sipped the last of her champagne, glancing over at Roger. "Well," she said, setting down her glass, "that was eventful." Roger let out a slow exhale, rubbing his temples. "You have no idea." For the first time in a long time, he felt light. No yelling. No constant need to prove himself. No Karen dragging him into chaos. Maybe, just maybe, this was the beginning of something new. As the passengers disembarked, Whispers continued to spread about the woman who thought she ruled the sky only to come crashing down. And as for Karen, she had spent years believing she belonged in first class. Turns out it wasn't about the seat. It was about the person sitting in it. What did you think of Karen's first-class meltdown? Have you ever seen anything like this in real life? Let us know in the comments. And tell us, where in the world are you watching from? We love hearing from you. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more epic stories. See you in the next one.